She did not sleep the night the letter arrived. Not because the letter was dramatic or urgent in its language. It was not. It was written in the careful, neutral tone of a solicitor's office, full of formal phrases and reference numbers, and the kind of measured courtesy that kept emotion at a professional distance. But May had read it 4 times before midnight, and another 2 times before dawn, and by the time the first gray light crept through the curtain, she had memorized every line without meaning to. The letter said she had inherited property. It said the property belonged to a great-uncle she had met precisely twice in her life. Once as a child at a family gathering she barely remembered, and once at a funeral for someone else entirely, where he had stood near the back and not spoken to anyone. His name was Clarence. He had been 79 when he died. He had left no wife, no children, no other family willing to claim what little he had owned. The solicitor's letter explained this with no particular sentiment, as though it were simply a matter of logistics. May set the letter on the kitchen table and looked at it in the early morning light. Around her, the flat was quiet. Her daughter was still asleep behind the second bedroom door, which was the only bedroom, because May slept on the fold-out couch and had done so for the better part of 2 years. The couch left a permanent ache across her lower back. She had grown accustomed to it, the way people grew accustomed to things they could not afford to change. The kitchen bench held a single bowl from last night's dinner, rinsed but not washed. The window above the sink looked out over a car park. In the corner near the hallway, a pile of mail she had been avoiding for 3 weeks sat between the cordless phone charger and a drawing Lily had made at school of a house with a garden and a dog. They did not have a garden. They did not have a dog. May was 34 years old. She had worked as a checkout operator for 11 years, first at a supermarket on the edge of the city, then at a smaller one closer to the flat after the bus routes changed, and the cost of getting to work had become something she needed to calculate rather than simply accept. She worked 4 days a week, and sometimes 5 when extra shifts were offered, which they sometimes were and sometimes were not. She did not spend money carelessly. She had not been on a holiday in 6 years. She did not own a car. The money she earned covered the rent, covered the groceries, covered the school fees, and the medication Lily needed every 6 weeks for a condition the specialist had said was manageable, which it was, as long as the prescription was maintained, which required the payment, which required the shifts. It was a system. It was tight and demanding and brittle in the specific way of systems built with nothing to spare, but it held. It had held for a long time. What it did not cover, and had not covered for some time, was anything beyond itself. May did not say this to people. She had learned early that the shape of her life made others uncomfortable in ways they did not know how to manage, so they offered opinions instead of assistance, or they said she ought to apply for things, various programs and benefits and extensions, as though she had not already done exactly that, as though the forms had not already been filed, and the outcomes already returned, and the numbers already confirmed, not to reach far enough. She had stopped explaining. She smiled and nodded and thanked people for the suggestion, and went home and did the arithmetic again, which always came out the same. The letter said the property was located in a rural district 4 hours south. It was described in the attached documentation, which May unfolded now and spread across the table beside the original letter. The documentation was dense. Much of it was legal language she did not fully follow. But buried midway through the second page, there was a brief physical description of what she had inherited. The estate, it read, consisted of an unfenced perimeter of land, measuring approximately 4.5 acres. Existing improvements on the property were listed as 1 timber outbuilding in poor condition and 1 boundary fencing structure of historical origin. She read the phrase again. 1 boundary fencing structure of historical origin. A fence. She had inherited 4.5 acres of scrubland and a fence. She sat with this information for a long time. Outside, the car park was waking up. A truck reversed somewhere below, its beeping regular and mechanical. The streetlights were still on. May folded the documents carefully, matching the original crease lines, and slid them back into the envelope. She put the envelope on top of the pile near the phone charger and went to make coffee. While the kettle boiled, she stood at the window and watched the car park, and did not think about the fence or the scrubland, or the old man she had not known. No, she thought about whether there were enough noodles left for Lily's lunch. There were, if she portioned them correctly. She told her sister about the letter 3 days later over the phone. Her sister lived on the other side of the city with her husband and their 2 children, and a mortgage they complained about frequently. Though the complaints had a comfortable quality to them, the kind that came with knowing the ground was solid beneath your feet. Her sister's name was Patricia, and she was 2 years older, and she had always been the kind of person who found practical responses to things quickly, sometimes before the situation had finished presenting itself. Patricia said it sounded like more trouble than it was worth. She said rural land that had been sitting for God knows how long without anyone doing anything to it was probably not going to be worth the cost of the trip, let alone any legal fees for the transfer. She said the fence thing was strange. She said, honestly, May, it sounds like the old man had nothing, and now he's given you nothing, and the solicitors want their fees, and that's really all there is to it. May said she supposed that was probably right. She ended the call and sat on the edge of the couch and looked at the envelope. Then she looked at the drawing Lily had made, still pinned to the corner near the hallway, the house with the garden and the dog. 2 weeks later, May arranged for her neighbor to collect Lily from school and keep her overnight. She took a day of annual leave she had been saving since February. She borrowed her neighbor's car, the old Subaru with the cracked rearview mirror that pulled slightly left on the highway, and she drove 4 hours south. She did not tell Patricia she was going. She did not tell anyone at work. She took the solicitor's documents from the envelope, put them in the bottom of her bag alongside her phone and a water bottle and a sandwich she had made the night before, and she left before 6 in the morning while the car park was still dark. The drive was unremarkable for most of its length. The city thinned out gradually, its edges becoming industrial, then suburban, then residential in the way of smaller towns, then finally rural. The landscape flattened and opened. Paddocks appeared on either side of the road, some grazed, some not, all of them bleached pale gold by the end of summer. The sky, which in the city was always slightly dimmed by ambient light and weather, and the general atmospheric weight of 1 million people, was here very wide and very clear. May drove with the window down a few centimeters. The air smelled different out here. Dry, with something under it she could not name, something older. She did not listen to the radio. She found the property using the coordinates listed in the solicitor's documents, following a sealed road that became unsealed after the last small town, then following the unsealed road until it became little more than a track pressed into the red earth by years of intermittent use. The Subaru managed it with complaint, its suspension registering every stone and rut and dried gouge left by old rain. May drove slowly and watched the land. There was no sign. There was no gate in the conventional sense. There was just a point where the track stopped and the land opened. And there, running along what appeared to be the property boundary, was the fence. May parked the car and sat inside it for a moment. She looked at the fence through the windscreen. It was not impressive. That was the first and most immediate thing about it. It was exactly the kind of fence that a letter might describe as a boundary fencing structure of historical origin, because it looked as though history had been doing things to it for a very long time, and the fence had mostly lost. It was constructed of timber posts, sunk at irregular intervals, though the irregularity was slight, suggesting someone had measured once and then measured again, and found slightly different answers both times. Between the posts, 3 horizontal rails ran the length of the visible boundary, their wood grayed to silver by decades of sun. In some places, the rails sagged. In one place, a rail had broken at its midpoint, and the 2 halves had not been removed, only left to hang at angles, giving that section a vaguely sorrowful look. The posts themselves were thick, thicker than they needed to be for a fence of this kind, at least by any modern standard. They were set deep. May could see that much just from the way they stood, slightly above the earth, with no lean to them, despite whatever weather had come and gone over the years. The wood was dark with age, and in places with what might have been an old treatment, something applied long ago that had protected the grain against moisture. The timber was not rotting. It had lasted. May got out of the car. The air hit her properly now, dry and warm, carrying fine dust from somewhere upwind. The ground was hard underfoot, cracked in the dry season's way, the red earth splitting into small, irregular tiles that shifted slightly when she stepped on them. The sparse grass was dead at the tips and alive only at the roots, waiting. She walked the length of the visible fence slowly, keeping a few steps of distance. She counted 9 posts along the front boundary before the fence turned at a corner and continued out of easy view across the property. She looked at the outbuilding the solicitor's letter had mentioned. It was perhaps 30 meters from where she stood, small and low, its walls of corrugated iron so weathered it had moved past rust into a color that was almost beautiful, a deep amber red that matched the earth around it. One window, on no glass. A door on leather hinges, standing open. She looked at the fence again. She tried to see it as Patricia would see it, practically, and without sentiment. 4.5 acres of scrubland, 1 building that could not be used for anything. A fence that might have value as salvage if the timber was sound, but probably not enough value to justify the price of the trip it had taken to reach it. There was no power to the property. There was no water she could see. The nearest town was 40 minutes back the way she had come. The nearest house was further than that. It was, by any reasonable measure, nothing. She had driven 4 hours to look at nothing. May unwrapped her sandwich and ate it standing at the car. The bread was slightly stale at the edges from the morning it had waited. She drank from the water bottle and looked across the paddock and let the silence settle around her. It was not the silence of the city at night, which was always relative, broken by traffic and climate systems and the general low hum of proximity. This was a deeper quiet, a quiet that had been here before the fence, before whoever had put the fence here, before any of them. She thought about Lily, about the drawing, about the house with the garden. She looked at the fence. After she had finished eating, she walked the full perimeter. This took a while, because the property was larger on foot than it appeared from the car. The fence ran along all 4 boundaries and was more complete than her first impression had suggested. The rear sections were in better condition than the front. The rails there were still horizontal, and still fitted into the posts with the kind of precision that spoke of someone who had taken the construction seriously. Someone who had understood that a fence built carelessly did not last, and had intended this one to last. May stood at the far corner of the rear boundary and looked back toward the car, which was small in the distance. She looked at the corner post nearest her. It was the largest post she had seen anywhere along the fence. Where the other posts were substantial, this one was exceptional. It was wider in diameter by a visible margin, its top cut flat and level, its surface less silver gray, and more a deep brownish black, as though whatever had been applied to it had been applied in greater quantity or greater concentration. It stood at the exact intersection of the 2 rear boundary lines, occupying the corner of the property with a solidity that felt almost architectural. She put her hand on it. The wood was warm from the sun, solid. She pressed her palm flat against the surface and felt the grain beneath it, tight and close, the kind of grain that took years to form, decades of slow growth. Old timber, old growth timber, the kind they no longer cut this way, the kind that was gone from the forests now. She took her hand away and looked at the top of the post. Up close, she could see something she had not noticed from a distance. The flat top surface was not entirely flat. Along one edge, there was a slight raised seam, a line of a different texture, as if the wood there had been cut differently, or had been separated and refitted. She tilted her head, trying to read it against the angle of the afternoon light. As she pressed her thumb along the seam, it didn't flex. Whatever the line was, it was old and set. She stood there for a long time, looking at it. The sun had moved while she had walked the perimeter. It was lower now, softer, casting the kind of long shadows that made details visible that the midday glare had flattened. In this light, the seam along the top of the corner post was unmistakable. Not a crack, not a split from age or drying. Something else. May stepped back. She looked at the post from a slight distance, letting her eyes travel down its length. About halfway down, below the lowest fence rail, she noticed something else. A slight variation in the surface of the wood. A small circle, perhaps the size of her thumbnail, where the texture of the timber was different. Not a knot. She had grown up around enough old buildings to know what knots looked like in timber. This was different, too regular, too deliberate. She crouched down, her knees clicking in the way they had started to do in the last few years, and she looked more carefully. The circle was dark, darker than the wood around it, and its edges were precise. She reached out and pressed her fingertip against it. It moved. Not much, a fraction of a millimeter, but it moved. May stayed very still. The paddock was quiet around her. Somewhere, a bird called once and was answered by silence. The warm air moved in a slow, barely there way, carrying the smell of dry grass and old earth. She pressed the circle again, steadier this time, more deliberate, applying even pressure. There was a sound, very faint, more a sensation than a sound, and something felt through the fingertip rather than heard by the ear. A release of some kind, a loosening. May stood up quickly, stepping back from the post. Her heart was doing something faster than she expected. She looked at the post, and looked at the paddock, and looked at the post again. She was aware, suddenly and sharply, of how alone she was. The car was far. The track was further. The nearest town was 40 minutes back the way she had come. She breathed. She breathed again. She told herself she was standing in a paddock looking at a fence post, and there was no reason to feel anything other than the mild and ordinary interest of someone who had driven a long way to see something disappointing. But she had pressed a circle on a timber post, and something had moved. May walked back to the car. She did it without rushing. She opened the boot and looked at the tools her neighbor kept there, the usual assortment of roadside emergency equipment: a tire iron, a small spade with a folding head, a length of rope, a torch, flat battery probably. She noted this and set it aside. A canvas bag of assorted items she did not examine fully. She took the spade and the tire iron and walked back across the paddock. The sun was lower still by the time she reached the corner post again. She crouched at its base and looked at the ground around it. The earth was hard, as everywhere on the property, but around the base of this post, it was harder, somehow. She pressed the spade against it experimentally. The blade met resistance immediately. Not the usual scraping resistance of dry topsoil, but something more complete. She tried at a different angle. The same. She straightened and put both hands on the post itself. She tested it for lateral movement, the way you tested any old post, to see whether it had rotted at the base or whether the earth had loosened around it. It didn't move at all. No give, no flex, nothing. It was not simply set in the earth. It was fixed to it in a way she could not yet account for. May stepped back and looked at the post from every angle. She looked at the seam along the top. She looked at the circle on the side. She looked at the ground at its base. She remembered that she had a flight of return to arrange in her own life, a borrowed car to get back, a daughter to collect, shifts starting in 2 days. She remembered 4 hours of driving and a sandwich with stale edges and a couch that ached her spine every morning. She also remembered that something under her finger had moved. She stood in the paddock in the long afternoon light, and she made the small, quiet decision that she was not going to drive away yet. Not until she understood what she had found. Or had not found. Not until the thing she had felt beneath her fingertip was explained or dismissed by something other than distance. She moved around to the back of the post, the side facing the interior of the property rather than the boundary, and she looked at the timber from this angle. The wood here was different in one very specific way. Where the front and sides of the post showed the same weathered gray over the old treatment, the back surface, at a height of about knee level, had a section of approximately 15 centimeters in height and 10 centimeters wide that was slightly lighter, so not pale from damage or from a patch of different growth. Lighter in the way of wood that had not been exposed to the same years of weather. Wood that had been protected, covered. May looked at this section for a long time. She put the flat face of the tire iron against it. She pressed, gently. The timber flexed, just slightly. But it flexed, and the timber around it did not. A panel. The section was a panel. May sat down in the red dust at the base of the corner post and looked at the land around her, all 4.5 acres of it. The dead-tipped grass and the cracked earth, and the old outbuilding in its deep amber red. She looked at the sky, which had moved into that particular late-afternoon quality that made distance look closer, and shadows look like intention. She sat there for some time without moving, just breathing. Then she looked back at the post and thought very carefully about what she wanted to do next. Not what she ought to do, not what Patricia would say, Not what any reasonable person accounting for the cost of a day's annual leave and a borrowed car with a cracked mirror would recommend. What she, May, wanted to do. The answer was not complicated. She was going to pull up the corner post. Not today. The light was going, and she had the drive back, and she had Lily, and she had the shifts starting Tuesday. But she was going to come back. She was going to bring tools, proper tools, and she was going to understand what the panel was, and what the circle was, and what had moved under her finger. Because the alternative was to let the fence and the paddock and the silence keep the secret for however long they had already kept it, and she found she wasn't willing to do that. She stood up and brushed the red dust off her jeans. She picked up the spade and the tire iron and carried them back to the car. She drove the 4 hours home in the dark, the Subaru pulling slightly left on the highway, the cracked rearview mirror catching the lights of the road behind her. She did not call Patricia. She picked up Lily from the neighbors in the morning. Her daughter smelled of someone else's washing powder and held a drawing she had made on the neighbor's paper of a horse standing beside a fence. May held it for a moment and looked at it, and then held Lily, and did not explain why the embrace was slightly longer than usual. She worked her shifts on Tuesday and Wednesday. She was efficient and polite, and her mind was not entirely where her hands were. On Thursday evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the solicitor's documents spread out, and she read them again from the beginning, looking this time not for what the letter said, but for what it did not. The description of the property listed the boundary fencing structure of historical origin. Nothing more. No detail about its construction. No reference to what year it had been built or by whom. No survey notes about the corner post. No mention of any structures within or attached to the fence. She looked up boundary fencing structures of historical origin on her phone. She looked up Clarence Hendrick, which was the full name the letter had given for her great-uncle. She found very little. A record in the electoral roll from more than 20 years ago, an address in a regional center she did not recognize, a brief mention in a local newspaper archive, a small article about a meeting of a historical preservation society in the area near the property, no photograph, only a name in a list of attendees. She looked at the name in the list. Clarence Hendrick, attendee, Historical Preservation Society, annual meeting. Historical preservation. May looked at the window. The car park was dark outside, the streetlights making orange pools on the wet bitumen. Lily was asleep. The fold-out couch was already pulled out, its thin mattress waiting. She looked at the name in the list again. She thought about a man who had attended historical preservation meetings alone, who had died alone, who had left nothing behind except 4.5 acres of scrubland and a fence of historical origin, with a corner post whose timber had never rotted and whose panel moved slightly under the flat edge of a tire iron. She thought about the circle on the side of the post, the deliberate, precise edges of it, the fact that it had moved. She thought about whoever had built the fence, and the thought came to her slowly, forming the way convictions formed rather than guesses, that whoever had built the fence had built it around something rather than simply to mark a line in the ground. May put her phone down on the table. She looked at the drawing Lily had made, the horse beside the fence. She looked at the old drawing still pinned near the hallway, the house with the garden and the dog. She had 1 day of annual leave remaining, when she could request another 2 as unpaid. She could ask the neighbor about the Subaru again. She could pack properly this time. Proper tools, a torch with batteries, water for the full day. She cleared the table and folded the documents back into their envelope and set them on the bench. She made a list on the back of an envelope, tools and provisions, checking them against what she knew she had and what she would need to find or borrow. The list was short. She was careful not to make it longer than it needed to be. She turned off the kitchen light and lay down on the couch and listened to the building around her settle into the night. The ache across her lower back announced itself, familiar and reliable as ever. She did not sleep for a long time, but it was not the anxious sleeplessness of the past 2 years, the sleeplessness of arithmetic and worry. It was something different. It was the alert, attentive wakefulness of someone who was going back somewhere, and who knew that when they got there, the answer waiting was going to be one of 2 things: nothing at all, or something she could not yet imagine. She stayed with both possibilities until the early hours. Then she slept. She was back on the road before 6 the following Friday. The sky was purple at the edges and black at the center, and the first birds were beginning somewhere behind the noise of the highway. The Subaru's heater ran on the low setting and made a sound like a slow, patient breathing. May drove with both hands on the wheel. She did not tell herself what she would find. She had decided this. She had decided not to construct any version of it in advance, not to let hope build a picture that reality would then have to rearrange. She had seen what hope looked like when it was disappointed. She had lived inside that disappointment for long enough to know its shape, and she did not want to give it that kind of material to work with. She only told herself what she knew, which was that the corner post of an old Paddock fence and 4.5 acres of inherited scrubland had a panel in its back face that moved under pressure, and a circle on its side that moved under a fingertip and a seam along its top, that had not come from age or splitting, but from design. She only told herself that. The rest she left to the drive and to the wide, clear sky opening above the road as the city fell away behind her, and to the particular quality of early morning light that made things look the way they actually were rather than the way you expected them to be. The track was still there. The paddock was still there. The fence ran along the boundary in the morning light and looked exactly as it had looked the week before, gray and weathered and unremarkable, the kind of thing a person could drive past 100 times without stopping. May parked the car. She took the tools from the boot. She walked across the red earth toward the far corner where the large post stood, its flat top catching the early light. She was not hurrying. There was no reason to hurry. Whatever was in the post, or beneath the post, or nowhere near the post at all, it had been waiting for a very long time already. It would wait the length of a walk across a paddock. May moved through the dead-tipped grass and the cracked earth with the steady, deliberate pace of someone who had already made their decision and was now simply executing it. The corner post came into view properly as she reached the rear of the property, and in the morning light, with the angle right, she could see clearly what she had almost missed on the first visit. The base of the post. The way the ground around it was not, in fact, the ground around it at all. She stopped. She crouched. She put her hand on the earth at the very base of the post and pressed. And the earth, which looked like all the other earth on the property, which looked exactly like the hard, cracked red ground of a dry summer paddock, gave slightly under her palm. Not much, just slightly. Just enough. May stayed crouched with her hand flat against the earth and looked at the corner post rising above her and felt something change in the quality of the morning around her, the way air changed before weather, the way light changed before something moved through it. She was very still. She was very awake. She thought, here. She thought, it is here. She opened the tool bag and got to work. The earth gave, not all at once, and not dramatically, and not in a way that would have meant anything to anyone who had not already spent a week thinking about a corner post and what it was doing in the exact spot it occupied. It gave the way a door gives when its latch has been disengaged and someone has finally applied the right amount of pressure in the right direction. It gave with a kind of recognition. May did not pull back her hand. She pressed more firmly, and the ground shifted further, and she understood within a few seconds that what she was pressing on was not earth at all. Or not only earth. There was something beneath the surface layer of dust and cracked soil, something that had been disguised by time and by the accumulation of the ordinary materials of a dry paddock, but which was not those things. She stood and took the small spade from her bag and used its tip to scrape the surface around the base of the post. The loose topsoil came away easily, the thin, brittle crust of it, and beneath it she found what she had suspected without quite articulating, a surface that wasn't soil. It was darker, smoother, compacted in a different way, and at its edges, where it met the true earth of the surrounding ground, there was a seam, clean, deliberate, a cover of some kind, set level with the ground, disguised by whatever had accumulated on top of it over the years, grass seeds and fine dust, and the residue of seasons, enough to make it invisible to anyone who was not already crouching at the base of this particular post, with their palm pressed flat against the ground. May cleared more of the surface. She worked slowly and carefully, using the spade at a shallow angle to lift rather than dig, not wanting to disturb whatever lay beneath. The cover revealed itself in sections. It was approximately 1 meter in diameter, circular, and centered directly on the base of the post. The material, once cleared enough to see properly, was timber. Old timber, like the post itself, treated and sealed and set into a concrete collar that gripped the surrounding earth. The grain of it, visible now in the morning light, was tight and fine, the same old growth timber as the post. The post and the cover were made of the same material, made at the same time, by the same hands, for the same purpose. May sat back on her heels and looked at what she had uncovered. She looked at the post rising from its center. She looked at the circle on the side of the post at approximately knee height, which she had discovered on her first visit, and which she now understood differently. It was not a fastening or a flaw. It was a release. She leaned in close. The circle was recessed slightly. She could see that clearly now. A plug of timber fitted into the post with a precision that had become less visible as the years had weathered the surrounding wood and softened the contrast at the edges. She pressed her thumb against it, as she had done the previous week, and again felt the faint movement. She needed something thinner. She unzipped the front pocket of her bag and found the multi-tool her neighbor had pressed on her before she left, saying she might need it, and she had said she was going to a paddock but had taken it anyway. She opened the thinnest blade. She worked it into the barely visible seam at the edge of the circle and applied slow, even pressure. The plug released. It came out cleanly, without splintering, without forcing, with the particular smoothness of something engineered to do exactly this. It was approximately 3 centimeters in depth cylindrical, fitted on the inner end, with a small metal lug that had been its anchor. May held it in her palm and looked at it, then looked at the hole it had left in the side of the post. Inside the hole was not timber. Inside the hole was metal, a rod of some kind, tarnished but intact, fitted horizontally through the interior of the post. Attached to it, barely visible, a flat tab bent at 90 degrees. A lever. She understood it without needing to reason through it. Her thumb found the tab and pressed it down. There was a sound from inside the post, mechanical, a series of small sounds in quick succession, the kind a lock made when its tumblers moved, and then a deeper sound from the ground itself, something disengaging at the base, and then silence. May gripped the post with both hands. She had expected it to be immovable, the way it had felt immovable the previous week, and so she did not pull immediately or hard. She tested it first, applying upward pressure slowly, the way you tested ice before trusting your weight to it. The post moved. It rose under her hands with a resistance that decreased steadily, the resistance of weight and fitted tolerances rather than fixed attachment. She shifted her grip, worked her fingers deeper, bent at the knees. She lifted. The post came free of the ground in a single, long motion, and as it cleared the surface, she understood why it had felt so dense and so old and so much heavier than a fence post had any reason to be. It was not a fence post in any true sense. It was a sleeve, a hollow cylinder of timber and metal fitted together, disguised on the outside as weathered wood, engineered on the inside as a container and a lock combined. She set it down on the ground beside her. It was heavier than she had expected, even knowing it was hollow, or its walls thick enough to have survived whatever decades of weather and heat and damp had tried them. She looked at what the post had been standing in. The concrete collar that had surrounded its base was revealed now as the rim of a shaft. The shaft dropped into the earth at a depth she could not immediately determine. Its walls were concrete, smooth and solid, their surface marked only by the fine lines of their construction. At the bottom, perhaps 2 meters down, there was no earth. There was a surface that caught the morning light and returned it, faintly, as metal returned light. May stayed on her hands and knees at the edge of the shaft and looked down into it. Her shadow fell across the opening, and she shifted to let the light in properly. The reflection at the bottom clarified. A lid. A sealed lid of some kind, fitted neatly to the walls of the shaft, its edges gripped by the concrete. She sat on the rim of the shaft and thought about what she was looking at. In the paddock around her, nothing had changed. The dead-tipped grass and the red earth and the low sky of a winter morning. The old outbuilding in its amber rust. The fence running its gray lines along the boundaries of the property, ordinary and unassuming in every direction except this one. From any distance at all, this corner of the paddock looked like every other corner. The post was the only feature, and the post was now lying on the ground, a meter away. And from a distance, it would look as though someone had simply removed a post. Whoever had designed this had understood sight lines, had understood how a person looked at a paddock fence and what they registered and what they passed over, had understood that the best place to hide something was not underground alone, but underground in the most unremarkable possible location, guarded by something that every person who passed it would see and immediately discount. May looked at the shaft. She looked at the tools she had brought. She had not brought a rope of sufficient length. She had not brought a ladder. She had not accounted, in any of her planning, for the possibility that the corner post was the entrance to something beneath the ground, because even her most careful imagining had not reached this conclusion. She had a torch, the batteries she had purchased new and tested the night before. She lowered it into the shaft and switched it on, and the light spread across the sealed lid at the bottom. The lid was metal. Its surface was not corroded. Whatever coating had been applied to it had done its work, and the sealed, dry shaft had done the rest. At the center of the lid was a recessed handle, folded flat. At its edge, a hinge line where the lid met the wall of the shaft on one side. On the opposite side, a locking bar. It could be reached, just barely. If she sat on the rim and extended her arm fully into the shaft, her fingers grazed the handle. She tried the locking bar. It moved. May looked at the paddock. She looked at the tools. She looked at the car, parked on the track in the distance. She went back to the car. She retrieved the rope her neighbor kept in the boot, a length of it, and she tested it against the tow hook and decided it would hold her. She tied one end to the tow hook. She brought the other end back across the paddock and lowered it into the shaft. She sat on the rim of the shaft for a moment. She was 34 years old, and she had not done anything resembling this since childhood. And even in childhood, she had been careful rather than reckless. She looked at the rope. She looked at the distance to the car. She thought about Lily, who would be at school now, and the neighbor who would collect her, and the shifts on Monday. She lowered herself into the shaft. It was narrow enough that she could brace her back against one wall and her feet against the opposite, and she descended this way, controlling the rope with both hands, until her feet found the lid, and she was crouching in the base of the shaft with the walls close around her and the sky above her reduced to a circle of pale winter light. She reached the locking bar and pulled it. It moved smoothly. She unfolded the handle and pulled the lid upward, and it swung open on its hinge without resistance, without complaint, without any of the struggle she had braced for. It was balanced, as the post had been balanced, as everything about this construction was balanced. Built to last, built to open when the right person came with the right knowledge, built to appear simple after decades of appearing to be nothing at all. Below the lid was not earth. Below the lid was a chamber. May shone the torch, and the light traveled the space, and her breath left her in a way that had nothing to do with the effort of the descent. The chamber was not large, perhaps 2 meters square, its ceiling now open to the shaft above, its walls the same smooth concrete as the shaft, its floor covered in a thick layer of a rubberized material that had sealed against moisture. It had worked. The chamber was dry. The air that rose from it was stale but not damp, the smell of sealed space rather than decay. And in the chamber, set on low timber platforms that kept them clear of the floor, were containers. 8 of them, identical in form, sealed metal cases of the kind used for archival storage, their latches lever-operated, their surfaces coated against corrosion. Each one bore a label on its front face. A small card slid into a metal clip, its handwriting in ink that had not faded. The labels were numbered, 1 through 8. May crouched in the shaft entrance and looked at the chamber and the 8 cases and the numbered labels, and she did not move for some time. She was aware, in a way that was not quite thought and not quite feeling, of the silence of the paddock above her and the silence of the chamber below and the silence of whatever had been waiting in this specific place for a specific length of time, that she did not yet know. She was aware of the fact that her hands were steady, steadier than they had been when she descended, because they had found something to do. And doing things was the grammar she worked in, the language she trusted. She lowered herself fully into the chamber. The floor was solid under her feet. She straightened and shone the torch across the cases again, slowly, one at a time. She opened case 1. Inside, wrapped in a sealed plastic sleeve, was a document. Several pages, their edges yellowed but not brittle, their text typed in the dense official manner of legal instruments. She lifted the sleeve and turned the top page toward the torchlight. It was a title deed. She read it twice before the meaning arranged itself properly. The deed was registered in the name of a man she did not recognize, a name that was not Clarence, and not anyone she could connect to herself. The date on the document was more than 80 years ago. The property it described was not 4.5 acres. It was 460. May read the figure again. She held the torch closer. The number was clear. The property described in the document shared a common corner with the property she had inherited, the corner she was currently standing beneath, and it extended from that point across a tract of land that her eye followed on the attached survey map, a map that showed in the particular fine pen of an old cartographer a parcel of land that swallowed the 4.5 acres of scrubland as a river swallowed a puddle. She set case 1 aside and opened case 2. Case 2 held more documents, but these were of a different kind. She recognized them as mining records, geological surveys, the formal language of resource assessment. They were dated over a span of years, beginning 3 decades after the title deed and continuing in a series of updates that tracked a specific vein across the survey area. The language was technical, but its conclusions were not opaque. The surveys described the presence of a deposit. They described its extent. They described its estimated value at the time of each assessment. May was not a mining engineer. She was a checkout operator from a flat above a car park in the city. But she had spent 11 years handling numbers, and she understood scale, and she understood the difference between figures that meant something modest and figures that meant something else entirely. The figures in the survey documents were not modest. She sat on the floor of the chamber in the paddock in the winter quiet, and she held the survey documents in her hands, and she felt the quality of the silence change again, a third time, as it had changed when she first found the seam in the corner post, and as it had changed when she looked down into the opened shaft. Each change had been of a different character. The first had been the silence of noticing. The second had been the silence of descending towards something unknown. This third silence was the silence of understanding, and it was the heaviest of them all. She opened the remaining cases methodically, one after another, setting the contents on the rubberized floor in the order she removed them. Case 3 held correspondence, letters written in ink in a hand she would later learn had belonged to the man named in the title, Deed. Letters addressed to a solicitor. Letters that described a decision. A deliberate, reasoned, and a carefully constructed decision made under circumstances she could only partially reconstruct from the words before her, to secure the assets, to protect them from a dispute that was at the time ongoing, to place them beyond reach temporarily, with the intention of retrieval when the dispute resolved. The dispute had not resolved, not in any form she could find. The man had died. Whatever had been meant to follow from his death had not followed. The assets had remained in the chamber, and the chamber had remained beneath the corner post, and the corner post had stood in the paddock of a property that had passed through a chain of ownership she could not yet trace, and had arrived, in the end, in the hands of Clarence. Who had found it? Who had attended historical preservation meetings? Who had understood what he had and what it meant, and who it ultimately belonged to? Who had died before he could do what he had intended with the knowledge? Who had left everything to the only family member he could find, a great niece he barely knew, in a letter written by a solicitor in measured language that said property, and said boundary fencing structure, and said historical origin, and trusted that whoever received the letter was the kind of person who drove 4 hours to look at a fence. Case 7 held gold, not bars, sovereigns, old sovereigns, British minted, their surfaces clean and their faces precise, each one sealed in a small cellophane envelope and stacked in layers within a slotted tray that occupied the full interior of the case. May counted the slots. She counted the layers. She did the arithmetic that had always been her most reliable tool, and arrived at a number that her mind accepted calmly, in the way minds accepted things they had not yet connected to consequence. Case 8 held a letter, handwritten on paper that was old but legible, addressed to no one in particular and to everyone necessary. It explained what the chamber held, and why, and in whose name the title had been registered, and what the registration meant. It explained the survey documents and the extent of what they described. It explained that the deposit had been confirmed in the final survey and had not diminished. It explained the gold as what it was: security, a physical anchor for a paper fortune, placed here because paper could burn and stone could not be argued with. At the bottom of the letter, in a different hand, more recent, ink still darker than the rest, was a single paragraph added later. The paragraph was in Clarence Hendrick's handwriting. She recognized it from the solicitor's documents she had handled so many times. He had written that he had found the chamber 30 years before his death, during a routine maintenance of the property. He had researched what he found. He had determined, with the assistance of a private archivist, whose name he gave, that the title was valid, that the claim it established was legitimate, that the chain of events that had led to the chamber's sealing did not void the rights it protected. He had determined that the deposit was currently, at the time of his writing, estimated to be worth in excess of $600 million in the mineral rights alone, separate from the value of the land, separate from the gold, and separate from any instrument that might arise from the historical documents themselves. He had written that he was old and unwell, and that he had no children and no family who would understand what they were looking at. He had written that he hoped whoever came would be someone who needed it. May read the paragraph 3 times in the light of the torch, in the floor of the chamber, under 4.5 acres of scrubland. The morning was cold, and her knees ached from the concrete, and the stale air of the sealed chamber pressed at her lungs. She read it 3 more times. She climbed out of the shaft. She crossed the paddock to the car. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open and 1 foot on the red earth, and she called her neighbor and asked after Lily, who was at school, who was fine, who had had toast for breakfast and was wearing the blue jumper. May said thank you. She said she would be back by evening. She ended the call. She sat in the car. After a long time, she called a number she had written in her notebook at home the previous evening, a number for a firm that specialized in estate and historical property law, based in the city, recommended by the solicitor who had written the letter about her inheritance. She had found the name in the documents. She had written it down without being entirely sure why. She understood now why. The call went to a message service. She left her name and the reference number from the solicitor's letter and said she believed she had found something that would require urgent attention and asked if someone could call her back. She described nothing else. Her voice was steady, precise, and very quiet. She ended the call and looked at the paddock. The post lay on the ground beside the open shaft. The chamber below was still open, its contents arranged on the floor as she had left them. Numbered cases in sequence, the title deed, and the surveys, and the letter with Clarence's paragraph at the bottom. She had left the gold. She went back. She closed each case in the order she had opened it. She closed the lid over the chamber and engaged the locking bar and climbed the rope back out of the shaft. She fitted the post back into its sleeve, applied downward pressure until she felt and heard the mechanism re-engage. She replaced the timber plug in the side of the post, pressing it home with her thumb until it seated. She scattered a light layer of the displaced topsoil back across the cover at the base. From 3 meters away, it looked like a fence post in a paddock. She walked back to the car. She sat inside it. The day was moving toward midday, and the light had changed to the flat, bright quality of late morning, the kind that showed everything clearly and without atmosphere. The paddock was dry and red and wide under this light. The fence was gray. The outbuilding was amber rust. The corner post stood exactly as it always had. May drove 40 minutes to the nearest town. She found the news agency, bought a notebook and a better pen. She sat in the car outside and wrote down everything, every detail she could render precisely, every dimension and sequence and mechanism she had encountered. She wrote the numbers from the survey documents as she had memorized them. She wrote the date on the title deed. She wrote the name on the deed, which she had also memorized. She wrote the count of the gold sovereigns. She wrote the number from Clarence's paragraph. 600 million, she wrote. And then she sat with the number on the page in front of her for a long time. She had $47 in her account that was not already spoken for by a recurring charge. She had noted this the previous evening, as she did each week, in the column she kept in the back of the same notebook she used for grocery lists. $47 on one side of the page. Now, on the facing side, a number that required more digits than she had ever written in that notebook for any purpose. She did not feel what she might have expected to feel. She did not feel the sharp elation of a story whose ending was obvious. Now she had learned enough about her own life to know that endings required steps, and steps required time, and time had a way of producing obstacles between a number on a page and a number in a life. She was careful. She was always careful. Careful was what had kept things functional when functional was all there was to hope for. What she felt was something more specific and more durable than elation. It was the feeling of having pressed her thumb against a circle in old timber and not walked away. It was the feeling of having come back, of having brought the right tools, of having been the kind of person that Clarence Hendrick had hoped would come. She drove back toward the property. Midway, her phone rang. The estate law firm. She answered and spoke carefully, giving the reference number and confirming her name, and the voice on the other end became attentive in the way voices became attentive when they recognized what they were hearing. An appointment was made for the following week. The voice said she should not remove anything from the property, and she said she had not. The voice asked if she could confirm the location was secure, and she said she believed it was. The voice said they would need surveyors and an archivist, and she said that was understood. She drove the rest of the way back to the property and parked and sat with the engine off. The weeks that followed were not simple. She had not allowed herself to imagine they would be. There were lawyers, and there were surveyors, and there were archivists who examined the documents with the careful hands of people trained to handle things that were very old and very fragile and very important. There was a mining consultancy who reviewed the geological surveys and went into the paddock themselves with equipment she could not name and spent 2 full days before delivering their assessment. Their assessment aligned with the surveys in the chamber. There was a historian who examined the title deed and the correspondence and the chain of custody, and who presented his findings in a document that was, in the precise language of his profession, unambiguous. The title was valid. The rights it established were legitimate and had not been extinguished by any subsequent instrument. The chain of ownership, traced through a series of estate records that the archivist spent 3 weeks assembling, led clearly from the man named on the deed to Clarence Hendrick, who had inherited it through a branch of family that had long since lost contact with its own history, and from Clarence Hendrick by the terms of a will filed with a solicitor in a regional town to May. The gold sovereigns were assessed separately. There were 240 of them. Their numismatic value in the current market exceeded their bullion value, which was itself not inconsiderable. The total assessment for the coins alone came to a figure that could have paid off May's rent arrears 1,100 times over. May sat across the desk from the lead attorney and listened to the figures being read out one category at a time: the land value, the mineral rights, the historical instruments, the gold. Each category was a number. The numbers had a cumulative effect that she experienced physically, a heaviness that wasn't unpleasant, a compression, as though the air around her had become denser. At the end, the attorney paused and looked at her and said it was one of the most significant estates he had handled in 30 years of practice. May thanked him. She asked about the timeline for resolution. He said these matters took time, given their complexity, but that the strength of the claim was not in question, and that she should expect to receive interim access to certain assets within a matter of months while the full transfer was processed. She asked if she could make decisions about the property in the meantime. He said within reason, yes. She asked about the paddock specifically. He said the paddock was hers. She thought about the drawing Lily had made, the house with the garden, the horse beside the fence, when she asked whether the fence had to remain. The attorney looked at her and then looked down at the documents and then looked at her again with the expression of a man realizing that the question meant something he had not expected. He said that the fence itself held no legal necessity. The boundary was established by the title. The fence was simply a fence. May thanked him again. She gathered her copies of the relevant documents into the folder she had brought. She had a folder now, a proper one, bought specifically for this, with labeled tabs and clear sleeves. She stood and shook his hand. She drove home. She picked up Lily from school herself, which she had not been able to do on a Friday since the shift changes 2 years ago. Lily came out in the blue jumper and looked surprised in the particular way of children who have learned not to expect things and then receive them. May drove home. She made dinner, the proper kind, with ingredients she had bought fresh instead of from the reduced shelf at the back of the shop. She did not explain to Lily what had happened. She was not ready to explain it. She needed the explanation to be real in a complete way before she gave it to her daughter, because her daughter had already understood too well what it meant when things were promised and then proved fragile. After Lily was asleep, May sat at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of her. She looked at the title deed, the copy the attorney's office had made for her. She had the original still secured with the other documents from the chamber, now in an archival facility. She looked at her great-uncle's handwriting at the bottom of the letter. I hope whoever came will be someone who needed it. She thought of him attending historical preservation meetings alone, standing at the back of a funeral for someone else, leaving the property to a great niece he barely knew because she was the only family remaining who might one day open an envelope and drive 4 hours to look at a fence. She thought about the fence, about the post, about the circle that moved under a thumb, about the deliberate seam in the flat top of a post that had been built not to mark a boundary, but to guard one. She closed the folder. She looked at the window. The car park outside was quiet, the orange lights making their small pools on the wet bitumen. Something had shifted in the room, or in her, or in both at once. Not dramatically. There was no sound and no signal. But the room that had been one room for 2 years, the room with the fold-out couch and the stack of avoided mail and the drawing pinned near the hallway, was now also something else. It was the room where a woman had sat with a letter that said she had inherited a fence and had driven to look at it anyway, and had come back. The phone had been ringing since the story broke. She had not broken it. The attorney's office had released minimal information in response to a property registration filing that was a matter of public record. And from that small stone, the ripple had moved quickly outward in the way of things that people found extraordinary, which this was, which she supposed she was beginning to accept. Her sister had called, Patricia, who had said it sounded like more trouble than it was worth, who had said honestly, May, it sounds like the old man had nothing. She had called twice the first day, 3 times the second. May answered on the 4th call, not out of anger. She did not have the energy for anger, but because Patricia was her sister, and sisters were people you answered eventually, even when the conversation was going to be uncomfortable for reasons that had nothing to do with you. Patricia said she couldn't believe it. She said it multiple times in multiple arrangements. She said if she had known she would have come with her. She said. She had always thought there might be something to the property. She said these old rural estates sometimes had hidden histories. May listened and said yes, and said I know, and said it was a surprise. She did not say what she was actually thinking, which was that the value of the corner post had been exactly the same on the day she drove alone to look at it as it was now, and that the only thing that had changed was that everyone could see the number. Neighbors came, people from the building, people she had nodded to in hallways for 2 years without occasion for more, came now with the brightness that unexpected fortune produced in others. She was kind to them. She had always been kind. The kindness cost her nothing, and she understood it came from a human impulse rather than a calculated one. The impulse to be near something that had changed, to feel proximity to the turning. The mockery was slower to appear in its reversed form, the way rivers were slow to change course even after the source had moved. Her supervisor at the supermarket, who had once assigned her the earliest shift change on the grounds that her circumstances made her reliable, said she had always known May was capable of something remarkable. May received this without expression. She requested her remaining leave and said she would be in touch about her return date, which she already knew would not come. The schoolteacher sent a note home with Lily, saying what a wonderful role model May was proving to be for the children, which she read and did not answer. The solicitor who had sent the original letter called personally this time, rather than through a paralegal, and was warmer than the letter had suggested he might be, and said he was very pleased for her, and said Clarence had been a private man, but a thorough one, and had clearly made a good choice. May said she thought he had. She did not spend anything immediately. She had learned a long time ago that numbers on paper required patience before they became numbers in life, and she had learned from a harder teacher than most what it felt like when that patience failed. She made a list instead. A careful, ordered list in the back of the notebook where she had always kept her arithmetic. A list that was different from any list she had made before, not because of its scale, which she was still learning to comprehend, but because of its direction. Every entry she had ever made in the notebook before this page had been subtractive. Minus rent, minus medication, minus school fees, minus the weekly careful choices. The new list was additive, and she filled it one entry at a time, beginning with the things that had been waiting the longest and working forward from there, through the debts that had gathered like silt and the needs that had been deferred until deferral became their permanent state, through the prescription that needed to stop being calculated, through the couch that needed to stop being a bed, through a house, she wrote at the bottom of the list, and stopped. She looked at the word. In the hallway, the drawing was still pinned to the wall, slightly crooked, its corners curling at the edges. A house with a garden. A child's idea of the thing her mother had never been able to give her. May got up from the table. She straightened the drawing with 2 careful fingers, pressing the curled corners flat, smoothing the paper against the wall. Lily had drawn the house in pencil and colored the garden green with a crayon that had run slightly at the edges, giving the grass a blurred, abundant quality. The dog was disproportionately large and faced the wrong direction, but its tail was clearly wagging. May stood in the hallway and looked at the drawing. She thought about a paddock, about red earth and dead-tipped grass, and a fence that ran in gray lines along boundaries most people would have seen and not thought further about. About a corner post that had stood in exactly one spot for longer than she had been alive, through heat and cold and the indifference of seasons, holding a mechanism, holding a secret, holding a name and a number and a letter written by an old man who had died, hoping someone would come. She had come. She pressed the drawing flat one more time and went back to her list. The first payment arrived on a Tuesday morning. May was at the kitchen table when the notification came through on her phone, a figure preceded by a plus sign, the kind of figure she had previously associated only with the accounts of other people. The interim release the attorney had arranged, a portion of the assessed gold value, cleared and accessible, while the larger transfer moved through its legal stages. She looked at the number for a long time. Then she put the phone face down on the table and made Lily's lunch because it was a school day and the lunch needed making. She told Lily that evening. She had rehearsed the telling several times, not in the sense of performance, but in the sense of someone who understood that words landed differently depending on how they were carried, and she wanted to carry these ones carefully. They sat at the kitchen table after dinner, the plates pushed aside, and May told her daughter that something had happened with the property she had inherited, that it had turned out to be more valuable than anyone had known, and that their lives were going to change in some specific ways that she wanted to talk about together. Lily was 9 years old. She looked at her mother across the table with the particular steadiness of a child who had grown up alongside financial precaution and had absorbed its rhythms without being told to. She asked if they were going to have to move. May said yes, but not in the way the word had meant before. But Lily thought about this and asked whether the new place would have a garden. May said yes. Lily looked at the table. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at the drawing pinned near the hallway, which she had made 3 years ago and which had remained there through 2 repaintings of the wall and 1 change of the light fitting, held in place by the same 2 pieces of tape May had put there on the day it came home from school. She asked if there could be a dog. May said she did not see why not. Lily nodded slowly, in the way she nodded when she was settling something into a place inside herself where she could trust it. They sat together in the kitchen for a while longer without speaking. The familiar sounds of the building around them, the car park below, the ordinary material of the life that had held them until now. May did not rush any of what followed. She had a pace that the years of careful living had installed in her, and she did not dismantle it simply because the circumstances had changed, because the pace was not a symptom of poverty. It was a characteristic of her, and it had served her at the base of a shaft in a paddock in the same way it had served her at a checkout register for 11 years. She kept the list in the notebook. She worked through it methodically. The first entry on the list was Lily's prescription. This required a specialist appointment and a new assessment and a conversation with a doctor who said the same things he had said before, but without the careful qualifying language he had used when he understood that cost was a constraint. Without the qualifying language, the conversation was different. It was simply medical, and simply about Lily, simply about what was best, without the parenthetical adjustments of what was affordable. May found the difference more striking than she had expected. She sat in the consulting room and listened to the doctor speak about her daughter in a way that had always been available and had simply not been possible. And she felt something in her chest release that had been held for a very long time. The second entry was the school fees, not just the current ones, but the ones that had accumulated as a balance over 2 years of partial payment and negotiated deferral. She paid them in a single transaction at the school office, and the administrator at the counter, one who had been the administrator throughout those 2 years, and who had handled every awkward conversation about the balance with a professional neutrality that May had appreciated, looked at the receipt, and then looked at May and said simply that it was good to see her. May said it was good to be there. They both understood the weight the words were not quite carrying, and were both content to leave it at that. She did not pay off everything at once. This was a decision, not an oversight. She had watched what happened when people received money suddenly and spent it suddenly, and found themselves standing at a different edge than the one they had left, and she had no intention of repeating that pattern. She found a financial advisor through the attorney's office, a woman named Daria, who worked in the kind of measured, unhurried way that May recognized and respected, and together they mapped the transfer of assets against a structure that would remain stable long past the moment of receipt. Daria said she was one of the most methodical clients she had worked with. May said she had had a lot of practice. The flat above the car park was given up without ceremony. May had not expected to feel the way she felt on the last day, which was a mixture of things she could not entirely separate. Relief and something else. The fold-out couch was sold to a second-hand dealer. The piles of avoided mail were sorted, finally, and dealt with one envelope at a time. The drawing near the hallway was taken down carefully, its tape peeled back slowly to preserve the paper, and carried flat in a folder to the new place. The new place was outside the city, not dramatically so, not in the way of retreat or escapism, but in the measured way of someone who had looked at what she needed and found it in a specific direction. It was a house on a quarter-acre block, with a vegetable garden along the western fence that the previous owners had maintained, and which was, in its current season, producing more zucchini than any household could reasonably process. It had a second bedroom, a real one, with a door that closed and a window that looked toward a line of old eucalypts. It had a bathroom with a bath. It had a kitchen with room enough for a table at which 4 people could sit and not feel crowded, though it would be a long time before there were 4 people to fill it. Lily walked through it the first time with the particular solemnity of someone who understood that this moment had weight. She went room by room without speaking, and May followed at a distance, letting her find her own pace. In the second bedroom, she stopped. The window showed the eucalypts, their bark in the afternoon light the same amber rust as the old outbuilding on the paddock. Lily pressed her hand against the glass and looked out for a long time. May stood in the doorway and watched her, and did not speak. The dog came 3 weeks later. A medium-sized animal from the local shelter, older than a puppy, younger than old, its behavior stable, and its eyes steady, and its primary characteristic, an absolute willingness to lie across the feet of whoever was sitting down. Lily named it without hesitation. She said she had known what she would name it for 3 years, and she was not about to change her mind. May did not return to the paddock for some time, but this was also a decision. The legal process was proceeding through its stages and required her presence in offices rather than on the property, and she was content to let the paddock be the paddock while the larger work was done. But she thought about it. She thought about it the way she thought about things that had mattered, not constantly, not intrusively, but with the occasional quiet return of attention, the way you return to a memory that had shaped you without drama or announcement. She thought about the post, about the long work of it, whoever had designed and built it, the specific intelligence of it, the way it had been made not only to conceal, but to endure, to wait, to release itself to the right combination of knowledge and patience, and willingness to crouch in a paddock and press a thumb against a circle in old timber and not dismiss what moved. She thought about the person who had commissioned its construction, the man named on the deed, and the circumstances he had been navigating when he ordered its making. She thought about what it meant to hide something with such care, to build a system of concealment so robust it survived decades of weather and seasons and indifference, and to do it while presumably uncertain whether anyone would ever find it. To do it on the strength of hope alone. She understood that impulse in a way she might not have before the paddock, before the 2 years on the couch, before the $47. She understood it in the way you understood things that you had lived near, rather than simply read about. The full legal transfer took 8 months. The attorney had said to expect more, and she had not counted on less. And so the 8 months arrived, and resolved without the accumulated disappointment of a waited-for thing. On the day of settlement, she signed her name where she was asked to sign it, and initialed where she was asked to initial, and listened to the attorney say the words that completed what had begun in the base of a shaft in a paddock on a winter morning with a torch and a rope and the borrowed car of her neighbor. She did not celebrate in any conventional sense. She went home and made dinner and sat with Lily and let the dog lie across her feet and told her daughter that everything was finished and everything was theirs. Lily said okay. She was doing her homework. The dog sighed. The house smelled of whatever was in the oven and of the eucalypts. When the evening wind came through the window, May had left slightly open. It was, May thought, an entirely ordinary evening, which was exactly what she had wanted. She drove to the paddock a month after settlement. She drove her own car, a practical thing, chosen for reliability rather than statement, because that was still who she was, and she saw no reason to revise it. She took the unsealed road and the track, and parked where she had always parked, on the red earth near the boundary, and she got out and stood beside the car and looked at the fence. The legal surveyors had placed markers across the property in the course of their work, and the markers were still visible, in small flags at intervals that had nothing to do with the fence, but that had re-established the true extent of the claim, the 460 acres that the deed described. The paddock she was looking at was a small portion of the whole. The rest extended beyond view, over a low rise, and into country she had not yet walked, country that was hers now in the specific legal sense of a registered title, and also in the harder-to-name sense of a thing earned by attention. She walked to the corner post. It stood exactly as it always had. She had replaced the soil at its base after the surveyors had finished their work, pressing it back level with the surrounding ground, removing any sign of disturbance, not to deceive anyone, simply because it seemed right. The chamber was empty now, its contents removed to archival security, so the locking mechanism confirmed sound and sealed. The post stood in its original position and looked like a fence post in a paddock, which was the only thing it had ever looked like to anyone who had not pressed their thumb against its circle. May put her hand on it. The timber was warm from the afternoon sun, the same warmth she had felt the first time, the grain the same under her palm. She stood there for a moment, with her hand on the post, and the paddock around her, and the sky overhead, in the particular late summer quality that made distances clear and edges sharp. She thought about Clarence. She thought about him finding this, in a paddock he had acquired through an estate. He had probably not examined closely until something, some instinct or some accident of observation, had brought him to this corner. She thought about him crouching at the base of the post, about the understanding that must have arrived as it had arrived for her, not as revelation but as accumulation, one detail at a time, each one extending the picture until the picture was undeniable. She thought about him choosing not to act immediately, researching first, verifying first, taking 3 decades to confirm what he had found before deciding what to do with it, because he was a thorough man, a careful man, the kind of man who attended historical preservation meetings alone, and who kept things because things had meaning rather than because they had value, and then getting old before he could do what he had planned, leaving it to her. She wondered what he had seen in her, or in the absence of anyone better suited, that had led him to the decision. She had been to his funeral once. She had been 11 years old. She had stood beside her mother at the back of a service for someone she did not know, and had not spoken to anyone, including the old man who stood at the back and also did not speak to anyone. They had been the same in that room, both quiet and peripheral, both more comfortable with watching than with being seen. She thought perhaps that was it. Perhaps he had simply recognized something. May took her hand from the post. She looked down the fence line, the gray rails in their long sequence, the posts at their intervals, the whole structure unremarkable and patient in the afternoon light. She looked at the outbuilding in its amber rust. She looked at the low rise at the far boundary, the country beyond it that she had not yet walked. She had plans for the land. She had thought about them carefully, and she had taken advice, and she had revised them and thought about them again. Some of the acreage would be managed under an agreement with the mining consultancy, the specific terms negotiated with Daria and the attorney's office to ensure that the process was controlled and that the land itself was treated with the consideration owed to something that had waited this long. Some of it would remain as it was, Paddock and scrub, and the particular ecological community of this specific dry country, because it was that too, and had been that before it was anything else. The fence she had decided to leave, or most of it. The surveyor had noted that several sections were in sound structural condition, and that the corner post in particular was, in his professional assessment, one of the finest examples of 19th century boundary construction he had seen in the field. She had not told him what it had contained. She had only said she intended to preserve it. He had said that was the right decision, and she had agreed, though not for the reasons he assumed. She was going to commission a restoration of the outbuilding, not a conversion, not a repurposing. A restoration, true to its original materials and form, because the building had been part of this place before the chamber had been sealed, and would be part of it after, and deserved to be treated as such. She had found a craftsman through the Historical Preservation Society, whose records she had obtained in the course of the research into Clarence, the same society he had attended. The craftsman had examined photographs of the outbuilding and said he would be glad of the work. She had one more thing to do before she left the paddock that afternoon. She had been carrying it in the pocket of her jacket since she left the house, a small thing, not heavy. She took it out and looked at it. A coin. Not one of the sovereigns, those had been placed in institutional care, but a replica she had commissioned, an exact copy of one of the 240, its face precise, and its weight correct, and its surface the same warm gold as the real thing under adequate light. She pressed it into the topsoil at the base of the corner post, using her thumb in the same motion she had used on the circle in the timber, pushing it down until it was level with the surface and invisible, unless you were already crouching and looking. A small anchor, a marker for herself of a specific kind. She stood up and looked at the post one more time. There was something she had been asked, repeatedly, in the months since the story had reached the people who heard stories. She had not given interviews, had not spoken to the journalists who had found her number somehow, and whose calls she declined without explanation. But within the circles of people who knew, the attorneys, and the surveyors, and Daria, and the acquaintances who had heard, and who asked in the particular way of people who wanted to understand the thing they were privately afraid they themselves would have missed. There was always a version of the same question. What made her go back? She thought about it. She always thought about it seriously because it was a serious question, or could be, if you meant it right. Not the version that was really asking how she had been lucky, because luck had very little to do with it. The version that was really asking what kind of person drove 4 hours to look at a fence that everyone had already told her was worthless. The answer was not simple, and she had not yet found a way to make it simple without losing what was true about it. The nearest she had come was this. She had gone back because she did not yet know what the post was, and not knowing was different from knowing it was nothing. Patricia had known it was nothing before she had seen it. Every practical voice had known it was nothing. The knowing had come in advance of the looking, and once you knew in advance, looking became a formality you could skip. May had not known in advance. She had only known that something had moved under her thumb, and that was not nothing, whatever else it was. She had learned this early and from hard circumstances, the discipline of not deciding before looking, of keeping the question open until the evidence answered it. It was the same discipline that had kept the arithmetic of her life functional when functional was all there was, the refusal to assume an answer and then work backwards to confirm it, the commitment to looking at what was actually there. It was not a remarkable quality. She did not think of it as one. It was simply the habit of someone who could not afford the cost of being wrong. But it had brought her here, to this paddock, to this post, to a chamber beneath ordinary ground that held a number so large she was still, in quiet moments, working out what it meant for a life that had been structured entirely around its absence. The light was changing on the paddock. The afternoon was tipping toward evening, the shadows lengthening from the fence posts in their old gray intervals, each shadow precisely the length of the post that cast it. May stood for another moment and let the light do what it was doing. She thought about Lily, who was at her new school now, in a classroom with a window that looked toward a park, who had made 2 friends in the first week and 3 more in the second, who came home each day with the particular aliveness of a child who had found the right conditions and was growing into them. She thought about the prescription that no longer required calculation, about the bath, about the dog asleep across someone's feet at this exact moment, indifferent to the distance, loyal to the household. She thought about the fold-out couch, about the avoided mail, about the $47. She thought about the number on the other side of the page. They existed together in the same notebook, the old arithmetic and the new, because she had not begun a new notebook. She had continued in the same one. She thought this was correct. The 2 kinds of numbers belonged in the same place. They were written by the same hand. They were the record of the same person, working with what was available in the same careful columns, adding where addition was possible and subtracting where it was not. May looked at the paddock one more time. The whole of it, the fence and the outbuilding and the red earth and the dry grass at the edges and the low rise in the distance where the surveyor's flags caught the last of the afternoon light. It did not look different from how it had looked the first time. It never would. That was the nature of the place, ordinary from any distance, unremarkable in every light, giving nothing away unless someone was already close enough to press a thumb against its circle. She turned and walked back to the car. The red earth was still hard underfoot, still cracking in the dry season's particular way. The birds were beginning somewhere in the trees beyond the boundary, the late afternoon calls, unhurried and sure of their hour. The air smelled of the same old things, dry grass and distance and time. She drove home. In the weeks that followed, she did what she had been doing since Lily was born, and before that, since the years when the arithmetic had first become the primary grammar of her life. She attended to the things in front of her. The restoration of the outbuilding began, and she visited when she could. and watched the craftsmen work, and learned the names of the materials, and asked questions he seemed glad to be asked. Lily started a drawing class on Saturday mornings in the town, and came home each week with something new in a folder. The dog continued its policy of lying across feet, and found new feet to lie across when Lily's friends began to visit, which they did with increasing frequency as the months settled and the new shape of their life became familiar. May met with Daria every month, and she had come to value these meetings not only for their practical content, but for the quality of attention they required, the same quality the Paddock had required, the deliberate reading of a situation without the imposition of a preferred outcome. They discussed the investments and the land management agreement and the slower progress of certain instruments still working through the legal process, and May asked questions and took notes in the notebook and left each meeting with the same sense she had left the Paddock with, the sense of knowing more precisely where things stood. She found the Historical Preservation Society, the same one Clarence had attended. She attended a meeting herself, sitting near the back, listening more than she spoke. Now the people there were of various ages and various levels of enthusiasm for the particular work of remembering things that other people had stopped remembering. She found she understood them. She joined. She did not tell anyone there about the chamber or the sovereigns or the number. She went because the society did work that mattered, and because her great-uncle had gone for the same reason, and because it seemed like the right way to finish the circle he had begun. At the third meeting, she was asked if she would be willing to help with a project documenting boundary fencing structures of historical origin in the region. The request came from an older man who coordinated the field work and who said they were badly in need of people willing to go out and look at things in paddocks. May said she had some experience with that, and she said she would be glad to help. The mining operation began quietly, as planned, in the controlled and measured way of something that had been prepared for carefully. She was not on site when it started. She had been told the date and had noted it in the notebook, and on that day, she had been at Lily's school for an event she had always had to miss before, a morning assembly at which Lily received a commendation for a project she had done on local history, because she was her mother's daughter and had spent the past several months visiting a paddock and asking questions about what the land held before it became what it was. Lily stood at the front of the assembly hall, holding her commendation with the solemnity she brought to things she considered important, which was most things. So May sat in the fourth row and watched, and felt the particular feeling of a parent watching a child in a moment that is entirely the child's own, a feeling that has the adequate name and does not need one. On the way home, Lily asked if they could go to the paddock that weekend. She had not been since the early visits, when May had taken her during the survey period and shown her the fence and the post and explained, in age-appropriate portions, the sequence of what had happened. Lily had listened to all of it with the same quiet steadiness she brought to most things, and had asked, at the end, whether the man who had left it had been lonely. May had said she thought he probably had been, yes. Lily had thought about this for some time. Then she had said that she was glad he had left it to them. May had said she was glad too, but Lily had said that she hoped he knew. May had said she thought perhaps he did. They went to the paddock that weekend. The restoration of the outbuilding was further along now, its walls re-timbered in matching material, its roof renewed, its window frame rebuilt. The craftsmen had done careful work, and the building sat in its corner of the paddock with a straightened dignity that suited it. the amber rust of the iron softened by the new timber at its edges. It looked like itself. It looked like what it had always been before time had tilted it. Lily walked the fence line slowly, her hand trailing along the rails. She stopped at the corner post. She looked at it for a while without touching it. Then she looked at her mother. May said nothing. Lily turned back to the post and pressed her palm flat against the timber in the same place May had pressed hers the first time, on a morning before the circuit had been completed, before the chamber had been opened, before any of the numbers had been written on either side of the page. The wood was warm. It was always warm in this spot, the afternoon sun finding the corner of the paddock and staying there, the old timber absorbing the light and holding it. Lily kept her hand on the post for a moment. Then she looked across the paddock, at the fence running its long gray lines, at the repaired outbuilding, at the surveyor's flags in the distance, marking the extent of what this corner contained, at the wide, dry country under the wide, clear sky. She said it was a good place. May stood beside her and looked at the same view and thought about all the things that were true about the corner post and the chamber and the man who had built the one and sealed the other, and the man who had found it and kept the secret, and the woman who had driven 4 hours to look at a fence, because she was the kind of person who did not decide before she looked, who did not dismiss before she examined, who understood that the difference between nothing and something was sometimes as small as a thumb pressed against a circle in old timber and held there long enough to feel what moved. She thought about the list in the notebook, both sides of it. She thought about Lily beside her, hand still warm from the post, and looking at the country with the particular clear-eyed attention of a child who had learned early that looking carefully was worth the effort. May said yes. She said she thought it was a very good place. They stood there together in the afternoon quiet, the two of them and the dog, who had come along and who was sitting on the red earth beside the corner post, with its tail moving slowly and its attention fixed on something in the middle distance that only it could see. The light was doing what it always did in this hour, lengthening the shadows of the fence posts across the pale ground, each post casting itself forward into the evening in a long, exact line. The shadows reached and did not quite touch the next post along, and the gap between them was the same at every interval, precise as intention, and steady as something built to last. May looked at the shadows and the post and the paddock and the country beyond. She thought, this is what it looks like when a person does not walk away. This is what is on the other side of the thing that looked like nothing. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.